Hello there. The last time you saw me, I was going on about the best books that I read in 2020, and I promised that my next video would be the worst. So that is what we're doing here today. These are books that I recommend you stay far, far away from, but at least you know what they are and what to avoid. Much like my best books of 2020, these are not books that came out in 2020. These are books that I personally read, and they're not in any particular order. They're essentially in the order that I read them. And these are not DNFs. These are books that I actually read the entire thing. I'm going to be making a whole separate video about books that I did not finish. These are all ones that I read all the way through. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start getting into these books. The first one technically was something I read last December. It's not something I read technically in 2020, but I thought I would include it because I felt it fit the list better. And that is Divergent. I got recommended this book by a friend because I was rereading the Hunger Games series, and she said that if I liked those, this is probably a book that I would enjoy. I think when I started this book, I was pretty neutral, but as it went over time, I really disliked it more and more and more. I finished it only because it was recommended to me. If I had picked it out on my own, I'm sure I wouldn't have finished it. But it's another one of those Hunger Games type girl in a dystopian future, and then she has a lot of weight on her shoulders based on like the political problems that are going on in her world. I think the concept could have been interesting and pulled me in, but the way that it was executed really didn't work for me. I know it's a dystopian future, so it's somewhat fantasy, but I just couldn't get that level of suspension of belief to be into this story. Basically, the world is split into factions, and the faction that she chose was, honestly, I don't even remember what it was called, but she's in the faction, the Gutless, I think, or Dauntless. I think it's Dauntless. But they're very gutsy, and they are trained to be like somewhat kind of like the police force, or not really police, but like that's the kind of thing that they would be doing once they graduated this program. And so they had them do things like jump on and off trains and jump off of buildings and all this crazy ass shit that it's like, aren't you killing off these kids that you want to be part of your society in the future, and just making them do crazy stuff that doesn't really do anything in terms of training other than proving that you don't have a lot of fear and you will do crazy stuff and don't care if you get injured. Then towards the end of the book, you get more into the political aspects, and they were just weak. I couldn't see myself enjoying reading any more of these. Clearly, I'm not going to finish the series. I have no interest in it. But a lot of the book was just showing all the crazy things that they do for training, and then there's a love interest. The political intrigue stuff definitely took a backside, and it wasn't really interesting at all. So I don't recommend this series. Of course, I haven't read the whole thing, but that's just my opinion on the first one. The next book that I don't recommend is The Circle. I actually watched this movie, the one with Emma Watson, long before I read this book. But I remember thinking that the movie was a little weak, but the concept was super interesting. So I thought when I read the book that I would get more information about the world and it would be better. Not true. I actually think the movie was better because it kind of cut out some of the ridiculousness. You're following the main character, I believe her name is May, but I could be wrong. But basically, she's a young 20-something and she's not sure where she's going with her life. And she gets offered a position in this great company called The Circle. I would liken it to if you got offered a really good job at Facebook company. And she starts as an underling, so she has more of a customer service job. But the whole thing is The Circle is trying to take over every aspect of your social life. So they want you to log every place that you go. They make her attend all these different events for The Circle and basically track everything you do. They track what you eat, how much you sleep, where you are, and everything. And it's super creepy and invasive. And it's a really cool concept, but the writing was terrible in this book, and the dialogue especially was really cringy. And I kept finding that the main character, would do things that were so unbelievable or just make really stupid decisions. So she would have an inner dialogue. It would be like if she had an inner dialogue saying, this guy's really creepy. I don't like this guy. He does weird things that creep me out all the time. And then she would go on dates with him. And you're thinking, didn't you already make a decision in your head you didn't like this guy, didn't want anything to do with him? And it would just be things like she'd have these thoughts and then her actions completely contradict what she was thinking about the situation. And I don't honestly even remember the resolution of the story. I must have blocked it out, but based on the writing and the dialogue alone, I wouldn't recommend it. And the premise is cool, but doesn't go anywhere. Just isn't executed well. So I don't recommend The Circle. If you feel like the concept is interesting, just watch the movie. It'll waste way less of your time. The next worst book that I read this year was Gods of Jade and Shadow. Honestly, I picked this one up at the library in February or so because I saw the cover and it looked really awesome. It kind of gave me this Aztec tomb vibe that I really like, so I decided to pick it up just because of that. And interestingly enough, a couple months after that, this author started showing up on BookTube a lot because she wrote this book called Mexican Gothic, which I haven't read, and I probably won't because, as you can see, this book ended up on my worst books of 2020. It's another situation where the premise sounded awesome. Our main character inadvertently wakes up an ancient god and then has to deal with, ferrying him through the modern world a little bit and helping him solve his quest, which that sounds awesome. But unfortunately, the main thing about this is kind of the main character's self-discovery and discovery of her self-worth, which there's nothing wrong with stories like that, but I just know that is not the type of thing I like to read. So I didn't know that going into it, and also it's very heavy on the romance or blossoming possible romance between the main character and the god that she wakes up. I'm also not super into romance books, so didn't know that going into it. The writing was decent, but I remember, of course it's been a while since I've read it and I have a bad memory, but I remember some of the interactions between the two main characters being a little awkward, and just some absurd things happen where the plot didn't really line up to me, and that bothered me enough that I gave this one 2 stars. So it didn't get a 1 star, but it put me off this author to where I'm probably not going to go out of my way to read anything, no matter how many people rave about her books on BookTube. The next book that I read came probably from the depths of hell because I've never heard of it or even heard of this author, but she's one of those prolific people that, you never think, oh, I really want to read a book by her, but she's written like hundreds of books. That might be an exaggeration, but she's written a lot of books. And a lot of them are really popular. Unfortunately, the one I happen to have was not one of those. And if I recall correctly, I think I got this at some kind of book discount sale, and I saw the cover and read a bit of the premise and was just like, okay, it's worth $1, so I bought it. This story was awful. This honestly might be the worst book that I've read all year. Well, there's another one I really didn't like, but I don't know at this point if I could recall the plot, and that's not just because of my bad memory this time, it's because the book itself was very confusing. That was one of the things I remember bothering me about it. So it's following a man. He's kind of like a private investigator type of guy. So someone hires him to go and check out this town and see what's really happening. And it's really bizarre. So it starts out fine, it's normal. And then as the story progresses, some weird scenes happen that have to do with witchcraft, and our main character just happens to like show up at the right time in the right place and just see things happen. But it's weird because he's a private investigator. He sees all these weird events happen where they're like doing seances and stuff, and then he never interacts with his client about what he's seeing. He never remarks upon it. It's just like, he's like, oh, that was weird that I saw that seance. Anyways, the next day I was going to the grocery store. It's like, what is the point of this book? Are we really investigating, or are we just kind of living through this guy's eyes as a window and just seeing some random events in this town where some people think they're witches? It made no sense, and the conclusion was extremely bizarre. It's one of those situations where, again, all of a sudden he happens to be in the right place where they're trying to summon the devil or somebody, I don't even remember, and he sees some weird, creepy ritual taking place, and then the book just ends. There's no resolution. So even if any of this stuff sounds interesting, just don't read this book. I'm sure you could find one with a plot that actually makes sense and has, you know, a plot where something happens. This is definitely not a good one. I'm not going to hate on this author because I know that she's written a lot of things that people like, and I think this is one of her most hated books anyways, so just avoid this one. Alright, my next book I read because it was a pick for my book club, and you might be starting to see a theme here. A lot of these books I don't like were recommendations or picks that weren't necessarily made by me. Maybe I should stop doing that. But anyways, the book is A Good Marriage, and this is a thriller, kind of a domestic thriller. A wife gets murdered, and then people in the town are being investigated because they're trying to figure out what happened, because there was some drama with some weird stuff was going on with the school. This is making no sense. So all the parents in this neighborhood, their kids kind of went to the same private school, and weird stuff was happening where like people's money was getting stolen and people were being blackmailed, and then all of a sudden this woman dies and they're trying to figure out, is all this stuff related or what's going on? This book was one of those where it's so bad you have to laugh at it. And one thing I've realized this year, based on how I felt about certain books, is I don't like a lot of thrillers. I just think a lot of them are just mediocre, or it's the same thing that's been done a lot. Okay, sorry if my angle's a little bit different. I had to go look up the synopsis of this one, and then it all came rushing back to me. So our main character is a lawyer slash prosecutor, and she gets a call from an old childhood friend who is the husband of the woman who got murdered, and he wants her to investigate what happened because they assumed that he did it. Based on the evidence that they found, they assumed he was a murderer and he got arrested, and so he wanted her help to get out. And just reading that synopsis brought me back to how stupid this book was. So our main character is asking people around the town, getting to know them and trying to figure out what type of person Amanda was, the woman that got murdered, and hopefully trying to figure out what happened. Meanwhile, there's like a subplot of the prosecutor and her husband, their marriage is falling apart. So when you're reading the book, you see a lot of windows into different people's marriages, and I have to say, and this is more my personal opinion, but it drives me crazy like how many people get married to people they don't like very much. And I know this is a book, but I know people do this in real life too. I can't fathom why you would choose to marry someone who you don't get along with or you don't like. But a lot of people in this book were like that. And that brings me to one thing that really bothered me. In this book, every single male character was awful. Every single one. They all had major flaws, and it was kind of painted like there is no good marriage, or the only good marriage that you can have is one where you, the woman, sacrifice a lot and learn to accept the huge faults of your husband. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to work out together. And I'm sorry, but that's not okay. I don't believe that every man is awful. And if you're with a guy that sucks, you know, you really could take care of that yourself. You could definitely get rid of him. I feel blessed that my fiance is a really, really awesome guy, but it confuses me when women in books or real life feel like they have to put up with craziness from guys. Like, get rid of these awful guys. Seriously, you don't need them in your life. But I'm getting on a tangent here, but that really bothered me about this book. I don't like when every male character is treated like they're stupid or they're a jerk or just all of them are terrible. It's not fair. And also, while she's investigating things, just clues that she finds don't add up. You know, I was going to go into all the things that I didn't like, but this is taking too long. Suffice to say, if you want to read a thriller, there's better ones out there. If you've never read Gillian Flynn, you should read her books instead. They're a lot better. Oh, Lord. So the next one, this is probably the most disappointing book of the year for me because I was mostly looking forward to it, and that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So to give a little history on how I feel about the Hunger Games, I think it's a series, first of all, that is really better the first time because one thing that I love about those books is the twists and turns, and every chapter, you know, when you read it the first time, you can't believe what's happening. You're your jaw's on the floor. You need to know what's next, and you just keep reading and reading. When I read it the second time this past year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, recently, it just didn't have the same appeal. I still like the story, but I wasn't like die hard, need to read what's next, because unfortunately, because I read it before, I knew it was going to happen next. But it's still a decent series. I do think Mockingjay is definitely far weaker than the first two, but I thought, okay, 2 out of 3 I thought were great. It's been a long time since they came out, so hopefully this book is amazing. Spoiler alert, it was not amazing. So you probably know by now, but you're following kind of the childhood / growing up into adulthood of President Snow, who in the series The Hunger Games is one of the main villains. So it is a villain origin story, which I think is cool. I have no problem with that. But this book was so weak, and for a lot of reasons. I think from the very first chapter, I already thought it was weak just based on the writing alone. I remember hearing a lot about cabbage stew and wondering what I was doing with my life. And one thing that bothered me incredibly was his cousin is Tigress, who is a character in the original Hunger Games. Maybe I don't remember this, but I don't recall there ever being some kind of connection between the two in the earlier series. So it made me feel like this was like retroactively made a decision. Like she decided later, oh, well, I want the cousin to be a character that people know, so I'm just going to make it Tigress. Otherwise, we don't know any of the characters except for President Snow. And I guess that's somewhat acceptable, but then by the end of the book, we didn't see any like breaking apart of Tigress and President Snow. And that could be because this is going to be a new trilogy or something. No way in hell am I going to read that. But we never find out if there was a falling out between the two of them, or why in the Hunger Games Tigress is trying to help Katniss and she never makes a connection to the fact that she's related and used to be very friendly terms with President Snow. Am I missing something here? Okay, but cabbage stew and Tigress are just two of the many reasons why I really didn't like this book. I do think that the writing was incredibly weak, especially the parts where we had singing. We had a character in this book, Lucy Gray, who is kind of a traveling performer, and so she ends up singing a lot, and it really made me draw a comparison between Harry Potter, which I'm rereading right now, and the way that songs and poems are written in that book versus this one. And I just think this author is not really skilled at coming up with songs. They just sound very juvenile, and there were a lot of songs in this book, and I didn't like any of them, so those were a chore to read through. Lucy Gray as a character, unacceptable. She's like Manic Pixie Dream Girl on steroids. And I know that a lot of things that happened in the Hunger Games were kind of shocking, but this book took it even to a whole nother level. They were doing things to the kids who were in the games that was just appalling, and no one had a problem with it. You'd think even in the capital society, there would at least be some people who are opposed to what's going on, but like no one had a problem with like putting kids in a zoo cage and just leaving them there with no food for a week. What? It doesn't make any sense. Honestly, it doesn't make any sense. I know, I guess in the games they're supposed to die anyways because they're killing each other off, but I don't know. And then when they fight, they're in a dilapidated, completely broken stadium full of junk and broken rocks and stuff. It's just, I don't know. I was having to disconnect as to some of the things they put the contestants through. And to go along with that, a lot of things that went wrong throughout the terms of them trying to have the Hunger Games started. Capitol bystanders were suffering and being injured and stuff because of some of the antics going on. And I just thought, you know, the people in the Capitol are supposed to be like the hoity-toity 1% rich people. I really doubt that they would be okay with their sons and daughters being injured and or killed because of the Hunger Games, even if it's an accident, I feel like there would be a huge uproar. It would not be acceptable. So the fact that they just continue to have everything go on really didn't make any sense to me. And to skip ahead to the very end, the end was the most interesting part by far. It really had that feel that the first Hunger Games book had, where like something interesting was happening, and it was written well to where you had enough that you could kind of hypothesize what you thought was going to happen, but it really kind of swerved and went all over the place and left you guessing. But that was just a couple chapters at the end, and it was left very open, and I don't think there was really a good conclusion to the book. And it was kind of like President Snow wasn't that bad of a guy throughout most of the book, and then all of a sudden he was like super evil. And it's like, what triggered that? What happened that made him decide, oh, well, I'm gonna be evil now? Doesn't make any sense. And I didn't like the mentor character that they gave him either. I felt like she was very generic and we didn't really know a lot about her. So I was really looking forward to reading this book this year. I'm very disappointed, and I don't know, well, I do know, if this series gets continued, I'm certainly not going to finish it. Okay, I'm starting to realize that this video is getting kind of long because I kind of love to complain about stuff, but I'm going to keep this next one really short, and that's because I have a whole rant review about this book. My next worst book of the year was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. What I didn't like about this book, it was cringy. I think that word sums it all up. If you want to hear more, watch that other video. Moving on. Okay, my next worst book was unfortunately from an author that in general I really, really like. I've talked about a lot of her books this year, mostly in a negative light, but I do really like this author. I hope to make a video about her whole series once I finish it. But that book is Blackwood Farm, and you might have noticed I don't own a lot of these books. I get a lot of stuff from the library, but I have collected a lot of her books over time, so I do own these. This is a book from her Vampire Chronicles series, and it's a very, very long one where not a lot happens. I've previously ranted about this one as well in a different video. But if you know anything about the Vampire Chronicles series, this one will disappoint you because first of all, we barely see any of the mainstay characters of the series. This mostly features new characters and not good ones. And it doesn't have a whole lot of vampire action, which is a bit weird considering this is part of the Vampire Chronicles. I feel like this book should have been separate, and it could have had a cameo from the vampire Lestat, which is one of the mainstay characters, but he doesn't really show up that much. He's a minor part of the story. And honestly, this book didn't even need to have vampires. I feel like this book was written in a time of Anne Rice's life where she was kind of more getting into being more serious about religion and her beliefs. And so she wanted to write stories maybe and felt like she had to keep that vampire gimmick. She's a great writer when in the right mindset, I guess. And this was just 630 pages of rambling nonsense. The characters are not likable. There is barely a plot. There's no vampires. So overall, it is a pass for me. The next worst book that I read in 2020 was a twofer. It was a thriller and it was a book club pick. Didn't like it. And it is The Night Swim. And this one kind of has a lot of the same faults that I saw in A Good Marriage. The characters weren't as weak. I didn't mind the characters as much, but I think the issues with plot holes came up again. So our main character is a podcast host, and she does kind of like a true crime podcast, which I know a lot of people are obsessed with those. I am not. That's what she does. So she's investigating a crime that's currently happening, which is not something she usually does. Usually she takes a cold case and finds clues and tries to solve it. In this instance, she's investigating something that's still going on and the trial is about to happen. But while she goes to this town, she gets an anonymous letter from somebody who wants her to solve a crime that happened many years ago, maybe 20 or 30, I don't really recall. So while she's kind of dealing with the case that's happening in real time, she's getting these creepy letters from this anonymous person that are like, my sister died here 20 or so years ago, but I think she got murdered. And I need you to investigate this because no one else will listen to me. Everybody stopped caring a long time ago. You're the only one who can help me. I don't really want to go into this one and just repeat the same criticisms I had of the other thrillers that I didn't like, but there were too many plot holes for me. The clues didn't line up in the way that made sense to me, and I didn't think that the story was interesting enough to warrant a read. It just wasn't very good. Mediocre at best, so it's a skip for me. Okay, and here's our grand finale. This is my last worst book of 2020, and unfortunately, I have to put Anne Rice under fire again for Blood Canticle. So this is the next in the Vampire Chronicles series, and I was so looking forward to it because I wanted to get away from the characters that I hated in Blackwood Farm. Little did I know that they are the same characters that appear in Blood Canticle. It's just a continuation of the story. The only good thing I could say about this book is that it does have more vampires this time. Oh, and it's a lot shorter. I think when I started reading it, it had a really strong start because at least it's under the perspective of the vampire Lestat, which is a really fun character. He kind of sounds like he's going off the deep end, or maybe he's a little bipolar in this book, but the way that he narrates can be kind of silly and really enjoyable to read, so I was loving it at first, and then when I found out these other characters were coming back in, I was pretty disappointed. This is another book where not a lot happens, and to be fair, that is kind of an Anne Rice thing, but usually her characters are far more compelling and their dialogue and stuff is interesting enough that the fact that there's less of a plot is not really a bad thing because the other things are good enough that it beefs up the book for you. And I mean, it's just not that type of book full of action. But there's usually at least a little. In this one, almost the entire book is them sitting around a table and talking. It's extremely boring. I kind of don't remember what the point of this was, and I didn't read it that long ago. Give me a second. Oh, so I just flipped through some of the pages to jump my memory and... Okay, so... In this book, a lot of the characters have been turned into vampires at this point from Blackwood Farm. Well, I shouldn't say a lot. The main ones. And one of them is related to this, like, weird indigenous ancient race called the Taltos. It's way too complicated for me to get into, and I don't even understand it all. But essentially, they're looking for these Taltos people who supposedly are in hiding somewhere else in the world because they want to find their roots of this one character named... I swear, these characters are so hateable, I don't even care to know what their names are. Oh, her name is Mona. Okay. So Mona, one of our main characters, is related to this ancient race of the Taltos. And she wants to know more about them because she's been like having dreams about it and she's having an existential crisis at the age of like, she's 16 or 17, I don't remember. She's not very old. So one of the other characters that's hopelessly in love with her because she's a manic pixie dream girl, wants to help her find the Taltos. So that's kind of the plot of this book. That's the only thing that happens is that they talk a lot around the table and then they go find the Taltos and then they find the Taltos. The whole Taltos thing is really, really creepy. This is a worse book and not something I think you should read, so I'm going to spare you the horrendousness of having to know about the Taltos and the creepy things therein. It was just a weird book. It was a weak book. I feel like it was something that didn't need to be written. And apparently, this book is a crossover somewhat of another series that Anne Rice writes called The Mayfair Witches. And I've never read those. I kind of want to, but I also think they have more to do with the Taltos, and I kind of don't want to go there, so we'll see what happens there. Even if you like to read books about vampires, you like Anne Rice, this just isn't one of her good books. If you want something good, the first three, Interview with the Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned, you really don't need to go past there. If you want to, the next couple aren't too terrible, but these end of the series books, just avoid, okay? Alright, so that is the end of my 10 worst books of 2020. I hope this was somewhat entertaining. I find it way more fun to talk about books that I don't like than books that I do, because I feel like I just say, oh, well, it's good. Oh, I like it. But it's way more exciting to pick things apart. And even if it may sound like it, I don't think that my opinion is end-all be-all. I just know that I've read a lot of stuff, and I feel like I can definitely at least pick out good writing from bad. Some of these books I didn't like because of my personal taste, but some of them just in general, in a completely objective sense, were just not good. Case in point. So if you have read any of those books, especially if you like them, I would love to hear your opinion. And tell me some of the strengths you thought were in some of these books, because I'm just curious. And if you agreed with me, I'd love to hear that too. My next video I plan on being my DNFs of 2020, so these were books that were honestly probably even worse than these because I didn't even bother to finish them. But that'll be my next video. If you enjoy hearing from me and want to hear about books from me, please consider subscribing, and if you're feeling generous, you could even give me a like. But that's it for today. I hope y'all enjoyed your Christmas, your New Year, and I will see you next time.